Hello, this is Dr. Dan Kahinka. The field of industrial organizational psychology is an applied science. What this means to the area of human resources is that the methods that are used are scientifically sound. They can be used across generations, ages, cultures, different industries. That is the strength, if you will, of the methods that are used. In this presentation, what we're going to do is we're going to review over a variety of different areas where the methods used by industrial organizational psychologists can be highly effective, ranging from job analysis and competency modeling to structured interviews, assessment, training and development, evaluation, rewards, and finally using these various methods to build a workplace culture. Let's begin by addressing job analysis. This is if you will, the first area within an organization that must be addressed in order to have uh, validity applied to the rest of the hiring, training, development process. If a job isn't accurately, if the skills, the knowledge, the various characteristics associated with the job are not properly identified, then potentially the wrong people can be hired. And no matter how much you train and develop these individuals, there will still be problems. We have not identified the best people for the job. So at the beginning of this process, we start with the job analysis. Now what is it, a job analysis? Essentially, it is looking at a job and identifying all of the different characteristics associated with that job, including tasks that are involved. Maybe it's physical ability that's needed for the job, emotional, psychological, knowledge, experience. All those different things are looked at to figure out exactly what is needed to perform a job. There are a number of different ways of conducting a job analysis, and I've listed those for you here. First off, psychological assessment. Put that first because of our field of psychology, and I do want to emphasize that this is not always needed. However, there are many jobs where psychological assessment is important to look at when you're looking at a particular job. As an example, if individuals are working, let's say, in the power industry, maybe they're working at a nuclear facility, and due to some of the dangers, some of the stress that's involved in that type of job, you may want to look at, does an individual have to have perhaps certain levels of coping skills, coping with stress, for instance. And this can apply to maybe first responders, firefighters, police officers, military personnel. It could apply in healthcare, a number of different areas where it's critical to have an individual that has certain personality characteristics. So that's what psychological assessment would be used for. Now, I put that first. However, that is more of a complex part of a job analysis, and for many roles that will not be used. For many roles, it'll be just a matter of doing something like observing the job, for instance. You, as an individual that's performing the job analysis, you would observe the person actually doing the job. Keep in mind, you want to select probably someone that's highly effective at the job, not observing others that don't know how to do it. So you find the right people to observe, you watch them, and perhaps even watch them in a way that they do not know that you're observing them, because at times, if you're observing people, they may change their behavior. So we want to perhaps watch them in ways where they are not going to change their behavior. Perhaps even let them know that we will be observing them just to figure out what skills are needed for a job, and that they should not be in any form nervous or anything. That can help. Using technology, looking, watching through, let's say, security cameras or something to watch how an individual performs a job can be totally inintrusive, where now you're observing them and they do not know. Observing people doing their jobs, however, can limit the amount of information that you obtain. What we don't know is perhaps, is the job physically strenuous? Is it emotionally strenuous? What is the person thinking as they're doing the job? That is why we do things like interviews, collect daily records, diaries, focus groups, conference meetings with individuals. These various techniques will help us better understand what is going on in the mind, if you will, of the person doing the job. In other words, we can interview them, ask them questions about what they're doing on the job, how they feel about it, are there things that could be done better, what knowledge, skills, characteristics are needed for that job. Similarly, we can do that for a conference meeting or focus groups or questionnaires. These can all serve that purpose, just in different ways. The daily record and diary, that is a strategic technique to collect information, because at times the people doing the job may not remember what they have to do for the job. And I don't mean necessarily the skills involved, like they forget how to do the job, but they might forget that certain skills are needed to do the job. In other words, as they're doing it, they're like, oh my gosh, yes, the person that does the job needs perhaps to have dexterity. In other words, they're working with certain parts and components, and they need to be able to do something, so that they remember that, and then they document that in their daily record or their diary. Job performance would be where you, as the analyst, the one that's actually conducting the job analysis, would actually do the job yourself. You may discover some things there that by doing the job that others you've interviewed, observed, all these other methods never thought of. And then finally, something a little bit more technical might be a motion study, where it is a very technical approach, and that is actually beginning to measure and count how many times people have to bend over, move, walk, all of those various things, because it may be a job, for instance, that's very physically demanding, and we want to not just look at the job to figure out what type of physical ability the individual is needed to do the job, but perhaps we can make even some improvements to that job, so that way when we eventually use this information to create a job description, it's the most valid information that we can get. What I mean by that is we may think that a certain strength level, for instance, is needed for a job, let's say a firefighter. However, by doing a motion study, we may determine that the individuals actually do not have to be as physically strong to do the job as we might think. And that is very important, because should someone not be hired for a job because of lack of strength, we want to definitely prove that that level of strength is needed. Otherwise, we may be, as an organization, there may be a lawsuit involved, and we may obviously lose that lawsuit if we don't do that. Which leads me to the final point here, and that is the job analysis is not just important for us to identify those knowledge, skills, abilities, and so on that are applied to the job, so that way we hire the best people, but also to keep us from litigation, to keep us from getting in trouble in any sort of way, or it could even be simply damaging our image by not hiring people that we could have otherwise hired. We want to have a fair, equitable approach, and the job analysis is the first stage of that approach. Now, the competency modeling approach is, you could consider it slightly distinct from job analysis, but also part of it. Here's what I mean. To look at the competencies needed for a job analysis would have to be first performed. Once that is performed, now we can begin to look at the various competencies that are needed. In other words, it might be individuals with high technical skills, high leadership skills. Once we start determining the various competencies that are needed, then we can continue to look at different things like education. Does an individual actually need a formal education to do the job? Or could it be that experience is what actually is needed for a job, or a combination of both? At times you may find that companies will be hiring people and they just think they need a certain level of education. That is many times very common in technical industries or professional industry, where individuals on a job application, we're looking for people that, let's say, have a baccalaureate degree, bachelor's, undergraduate degree, when actually, if a person has experience, they do not need that degree. So we want to make sure, in order to, once again, get the best people, that we properly conduct a job analysis, look at the competencies needed for the job, so therefore we are not requiring things of our job candidates that are actually not needed. Uh, Knowledge, depending on the organization, perhaps levels of knowledge are needed or not so much. What I mean by that is, imagine hiring individuals as in sales or marketing, and you're the type of organization that trains from within. You want to hire people that you in turn will train and groom and create people based on your philosophy. Therefore, maybe you do not want people with a certain level of knowledge when it comes to sales and marketing. You want to train them yourself. Or you may need people to very quickly fill positions that already know what they're doing, so you want to have high knowledge levels. Well, this is all part of this job analysis competency modeling approach, is to be able to consider all of these things. So that way we're not just looking at what we believe is needed for the job and what we analyze in that job analysis process, but also we look at our culture, our needs, all of those other things to figure out, okay, what exactly do we want to consider as a level of experience, knowledge, education, and so on, based on these other circumstances. And that has to do with skills and abilities as well. We want to figure out through the job analysis process what skills and abilities are needed. And then again, in the competency modeling approach, is to take that a step further and begin to seriously consider what is needed for the job, what levels of these various skills and abilities are needed in order us to in an equitable manner, a more perhaps profitable manner, to fill these positions. Now, once we've done this process, once we've conducted a job analysis, figured out the competencies that are needed, create a job description, seek out candidates for the job, we now in turn will begin interviewing these individuals. And many times this would be, we'll say, the second area where organizations may begin to start to fail in their selection process, is because the interviews that they conduct may be unstructured. The interview may change from one candidate to the next. For example, an interviewer may be interviewing people in the morning. They're fresh, they're not tired, they had a good night's sleep, they're ready to go. So they have very effective interviews in the morning, but by afternoon, if they've now interviewed, let's say, 5 or 10 people already, they might be tired, ready to go home, ready to stop working for the day and move the interview along much more quickly and not perhaps ask the right questions. Therefore, you have now an unfair, inequitable type of process, and from an interviewer standpoint, well, now you may not be selecting the best people because you've changed the way you're interviewing them. And from the candidate's standpoint, if you are not giving a fair, equitable opportunity compared to others, then perhaps there again that may give a bad impression of the organization, all the way up to leading to perhaps lawsuit. So what is a structured interview? Well, what a structured interview is, it addresses these various challenges, including bias in the decision-making process. It begins, here again, going back to job analysis. Then we look at competencies. Now, based on the job analysis and competencies, we develop a structured interview. It's a very systematic approach. We look at scoring the various areas the various competencies, for instance, that are needed for the job, and weighting those. As an example, if a job, let's say the job is for a salesperson, and we know, based on our job analysis and competency modeling approach, we know that the person needs to be very extroverted. The sales position that requires individuals going, let's say, to conferences, to meetings, various customers, and they need to be positive and energetic and very extroverted in order to talk to various people in order to get the business. So we may weight that very high. That might be, in other words, it might be that particular characteristic of being extroverted. Maybe it's 10, 20, 30% of what we're looking for. Versus if the salesperson is virtual and the people they're talking to are already current customers and they are just filling orders. Well, they don't necessarily need to be extroverted. Maybe a little bit, so maybe that's weighted at only like 1% of the job or something, and it's just part of a broader, let's say, psychological assessment or something of that nature. Uh, Similarly, if it is a job that requires, let's say, a lot of physical strength, well, then we perhaps would look at during our interview process if the ability of an individual, and then we might weight that high, and among all those other things that are needed. So what ends up happening is, once again, based on the job analysis competency modeling approach, we develop this systematic approach to interviewing where we score individuals, those scores are weighted, and then what ends up occurring as a result is we now have a standardized, replicable approach to the interviews. That individual that's interviewed first in the morning or last in the afternoon, or if it's a night shift in the middle of the night, whenever it is, doesn't matter when they're interviewed or even by whatever individuals are interviewing them. In other words, there might be 10 different people conducting interviews. They will, for the most part, be conducted the same. The same questions will be asked. The same responses will be given to those questions, and it's replicable. That is very important in order to give a fair, equitable opportunity for those job applicants, but then again also to be able to select the best people, because now we are controlling that interview process. Some examples might be a scripted phone interview. It may be the very first interview that's conducted with the individuals, so it's conducted over the phone, maybe over the internet, and the same questions are asked from one candidate to the next. A very effective approach that I've been personally involved in is where an organization interviewed me over the phone. It was recorded, and then what ended up happening is the person that did the interviewing was no longer involved in the interview process. Instead, you had other people that listened to the recording and scored it. Now, this is a very highly effective approach, because now what ends up happening is the person conducting the interview is their bias does not impact to any large degree the selection process, because all they do is ask the questions, maybe some follow-up questions, but then they're taken out of it. Now it's just people simply listening to the recording and scoring the responses. That is a very example of a very structured interview approach. Advantages and disadvantages to the interview process, particularly structured interview process, would be that because it's structured, an advantage, as we've already mentioned, is limiting bias, creating a standardized, replicable approach. Perhaps a disadvantage might be that it lacks some personality. It lacks that individual attention to the job candidates. Although it could be that the first, second round of interviews, depending on the position, are more structured. And then perhaps as we approach selecting, let's say, 1 out of 2 or 3 final candidates, that there's maybe a little less structure. Now, that does not necessarily mean we're biased towards a certain individual versus another. It just means that we take a little bit different approach to how those final interviews are conducted. Now, psychological assessment. When it comes to when it comes to whether it be selecting people, training, developing people, the area of psychological assessment for industrial organizational psychologists is an important one, because it is something, it's a unique feature many times of what is done within the workplace in order to figure people out, in order to figure out who should be selected, trained, what the challenges are that they're having on the job. It could even involve such things as communication skills, emotions, attitudes. All of those different things can be looked at to help improve in an organization. I have some examples here of perhaps leadership assessment. We may have an organization where we really want to emphasize the importance of developing quality leaders and identifying quality leaders. It may be that individuals that do not have any sort of formal title, like director, they are working on the front lines. Once again, they have no title, no supervisory role whatsoever, but they may be a very effective leader if given the opportunity. So, an industrial organizational psychologist can perform a whole variety of leadership type assessments to determine who may have some of the most uh, useful, best leadership characteristics that can be developed, and then these individuals may be in turn developed for various supervisory management positions. Different types of psychological, cognitive type of assessments may be looking for, as we mentioned earlier, if it's roles where maybe it involves more stress. So during the selection process, we use something like this to look for people that might be more prone to stress, or in certain stressful jobs, perhaps periodically, we conduct a psychological assessment to determine if people are very stressed out, if they're experiencing high levels of stress that are leading to burnout, and which in turn can lead to problematic behaviors. This may, for example, this may apply to law enforcement professionals. We do not necessarily, of course, want law enforcement professionals that are burned out, see people just as like numbers. It's called depersonalization. They are no longer looking at people as individuals. They're just doing their job. These can lead to problematic behaviors as these professionals are no longer acting in a professional manner. They may not even be aware of it because they are burned out. Well, how you discover that is to conduct psychological assessments like a burnout inventory or something like that. And then finally, skills. Assessments can be used to evaluate individuals' levels of skills and the various behaviors and abilities and knowledge associated with skills. Continuing along, training, once, if you want to look at our what we've identified so far is we want to determine what skills and abilities are needed for a job. We've now selected the right people. We've done perhaps a variety of psychological assessments. And at some point, perhaps sooner than later, we need to train these individuals. Many times this occurs on the very first day on the job, where there is something like an orientation that's performed. It might be getting people acclimated to the facility where people work, so that way they are trained on proper safety procedures. It might be training them to do specific jobs if they have no experience in the job. The area of training is one where industrial organizational psychologists can really not just help create a more effective training environment, but also can help an organization save a lot of money by reducing costs associated with training. So how are these two things done? Well, first off, what professionals will know if they are if they have a lot of not just experience but knowledge about how people learn, they will know. And if you look at this learning pyramid here, they will know that, for instance, teaching others can help individuals learn the most and retain the most amount of information. When you're teaching others, you have to know how to do the job. So even someone on the first day of work, and I have applied these things that we're talking about here. You can take, if it's obviously if it's a simpler role, such as training someone in manufacturing or distribution, how to put together, let's say, components on various technological parts. Those things can be taught perhaps in a very short period of time before the person goes on the job. But how you teach them can lead to better performance or not, and it can lead to where you get that person working quicker than another. Here's what I mean by that. Imagine it's a person's first day on the job, and immediately they get in front of the trainer and the trainer talks for half an hour, and just talks about what is needed on the job. Well, in some ways, this may be wasted time. If it is not critical information, my approach as an industrial organizational psychologist is if it's not critical, then wait. Do it later. Find some other way to do that information. Our goal is to get that person working as soon as possible and to some degree uh, creating revenue for the organization. If they are sitting in a chair being trained, not doing anything, they're not driving that revenue. They're not building the parts or selecting the pieces for distribution or helping the individuals or whatever it is. Now, they can read about the information, they can look at a PowerPoint, they can watch a video like you are doing right now. However, the best way again is to actually perform the tasks and to teach others how to do it. One example is in a distribution center where I was in charge of a training program. Within minutes almost of those individuals coming into the training room, I had them already looking at the items that they were going to be selecting in the distribution center and figuring out how to take those items. It was clothing, so they would figure out how to fold the clothes, put them in a box, fill an order. I had them doing that very, very quickly. And after giving them a brief presentation how to do it, very brief, I had them now teaching each other. So even if they did not master these skills yet, which I did not expect them to because of my presentation was very brief, I could now observe them teaching someone else. And so what that did was it had to force them to understand and think about what they were doing rather than just observing me or even just doing it themselves. They had to now teach someone else. So if they made a mistake by teaching someone else, I would correct them, but they would learn. They would not forget that anymore. And then if you did it in the way I did, then you might switch the roles where now the person being trained was now the teacher and the teacher was the one being trained. By doing this method in that one experience I'm describing, I was able to cut down the amount of time people were trained significantly. It went from almost 5, 6, 7 hours of training down to almost 1 before they were working. And errors reduced, performance increased, a whole number of positive outcomes were associated with that. And the reason was because I understood the scientific approach to training people. Here again, this applies across cultures and industries and age groups. These things will always apply, or for the most part will always apply, right? So once again, as I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, this is one of the strengths of using the science that industrial organizational psychologists study to improve in this particular area of training. Now, training and development are similar. What I would argue, the way I define the difference may be that when an individual is trained, they're learning more of the tasks associated with the job, what they do on a daily, weekly basis. They're figuring out schedules and what to do and where and how to find things and all that kind of stuff. That's training. Development, however, is something it may begin to occur on the first day of the job, but it is more individualized. It is more about perhaps some of those intrinsic needs, for instance, or skills or abilities, such as leadership skills, communication skills, how to interact with people, perhaps presentation skills. Some of these things that are not necessarily you are trained on. Now, here's what I mean by that specifically. You can train someone on how to use, let's say, a certain piece of software, but the development comes to where now you are developing a person at how maybe to use that software to present a presentation like we're doing here, how to talk to people, how to ask questions, things of this nature. That's more in the area of development. Part of the development process in this picture you can see here is knowing and understanding yourself. Because if you know yourself, then you are more likely to understand what type of development you need. For instance, you may know that you lack some leadership skills And maybe you are a director in an organization or a manager, supervisor, and you need to develop your leadership skills. Well, someone may notice that about you, but you also need to know yourself what skills you need. So a combination of others helping you figure that out and you helping you figure that out about yourself can then in turn help with the development process. Part of the development process might be finding mentors and role models, mapping out a plan for yourself, as I mentioned, involving others in the process. Of course, assessing the outcomes and doing it objectively. In other words, did you really learn, in the case of leadership, did you really learn those skills and now have the ability to apply them? And then finally, to consistently, constantly be reassessing yourself and looking at those various knowledge, skills, abilities, all those various characteristics that we're looking at in the area of development to see where you may need to circle back around to and get additional development or start something new. Self-actualization, that's part of that understanding yourself. It may have to do with your personality, your communication skills, your leadership skills, as we've mentioned. Now, evaluation is something that can apply to everything that we've talked about already in one form or another. In other words, evaluation of the job analysis, the selection process, well, we have to evaluate the people doing that. So not only are they serving one role by actually conducting those tasks, but they themselves need to be evaluated. So we need to evaluate their performance. The people that are doing the training, we need to evaluate them as well as the trainees, the ones that are going forth and doing the jobs. The development process, we need to evaluate, are individuals that are being developed, is the development process working? Are the people doing the development, is that working? Do they have the knowledge, the skills, the abilities to do that? Some ways of doing this in a unbiased, or I should say to limit bias and to do it in an effective way, similar to what we discussed before about the structured interview. One method is multi-rater feedback. When people are evaluated, when employees are evaluated, many times that is done by one individual. It might be your supervisor. It might be whoever that the boss is of that position may be evaluating your performance. Many times that can be done just on an annual basis. Well, there's a problem with that. The frequency of that process is such where an individual forgets about the evaluation process until maybe, let's say, a month or even a week before the evaluation occurs. Then they start thinking about it. They go through the evaluation and then they forget about it again. So frequency is very important. When you do something like a multi-rater feedback approach, what you can do is perhaps that is only done annually, but then other types of evaluation is done throughout the year. So here's an example. First off, what is multi-rater feedback? An example of that would be, if it is, we'll go back to the example of a sales role. So if you're a salesperson, you will not just get feedback from your supervisor, you can also give your own feedback. In other words, evaluate yourself, let your supervisor know how you believe you are doing and why and what information you are using to justify that. We can also look at other individuals. We can look at your peers, perhaps this other people on your sales team. It could be other people that you interact with, such as marketing or accounting, for instance, and interviewing, getting information, however that's done, surveying, questionnaires, but getting information from those people in those other departments to evaluate you as that salesperson. Who else can we go to? Well, we can also go, for instance, to the customer, and we can then in turn, for that sales individual, talk to their customers, perhaps even talk to people that are not their customers that they have interacted with, and evaluate their performance. So in other words, if they're not a customer, and if they're willing to at least give us some feedback on why they did not purchase the item, well, then we might be able to better learn what areas of that salesperson need to be developed. Multi-rater feedback is a highly effective approach The, the administration of the approach, I would argue, is just as important as the process itself. In other words, we have to consider things like are we interviewing people, when we're doing this evaluation, are we interviewing people that don't like this person for some reason? So now there's significant bias in the feedback that they're giving. Are we interviewing people that perhaps on the other end of the spectrum, they really like this person, they're friends. So now that feedback is going to be extremely positive, and maybe it shouldn't be. Factors like that need to be considered in order to have a reliable approach. So while this approach is very valid and very reliable, there are other areas associated with the administration of the approach that must also be reliable in order for this methodology, this method to work. The approach, if done properly, can be fair and equitable. In other words, if one individual is doing the evaluation and that they perhaps like someone versus the other, well, then very easily that evaluation can be biased for one or the other. However, if a lot of people are involved in the process, that can limit that bias and create a much more fair, equitable approach. It can also be very engaging. Rather than, even if that multi-rater feedback is done once a year, at least now the individual that's being evaluated is involved in the process. They are better understanding their peers, how they view them, their supervisors, their customers, people in other departments. They're engaged in the process. They understand more about themselves and what they need to do to be a more effective employee. Going back to frequency, what I've described here is an approach that it may be done just once a year because it's more involved, a bit more costly to do this. However, there are other components of an evaluation process that can be done throughout the year to make sure that those employees are still engaged with the process. In other words, it may be, let's say, a monthly review with that employee where the supervisor asks them, how are you doing with this specific area? We identified in that multi-rater feedback that you need to improve, let's say, communication skills. How's that going? What's occurring? How else can I help you improve that certain area that you need to improve that was identified in the multi-rater feedback evaluation? By doing that, now the employees are more engaged in the evaluation process throughout the year. It's not something that's just done, forgotten about, and then we circle back around and remember it a year later. It's done consistently, depending on the organization, depending on the budgeting. How much is budgeted towards evaluation. All of those various factors, I definitely understand are part of the evaluation process that need to be considered. But I will just leave you with this, and that is the more structured, the more people involved in the evaluation process, the more fair, equitable the process will be, and the more effective the process can be. Now, when people are hired, trained, developed, evaluated, now we want to consider rewards. How are we rewarding these people that are going through all of these things if they're effective on the job? Or they're not effective. Maybe there's something else. They're not receiving these rewards. I'm not talking about punitive action, but maybe they're not receiving these rewards. So we want to make sure that people that are doing their job, are doing it effectively, are doing it at high levels, are our top employees. We want to make sure they are properly rewarded. Many times organizations will simply reward employees by giving them, let's say, more money. Their compensation increases. However, research will show that rewarding with money is not nearly as effective as you might think. What does money do? Well, to better understand what money does and what other types of rewards do, how they contribute to motivation, for instance, and performance, we can look at something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Individuals at the lowest level, they want to have food, water, sleep. They want to be able to breathe clean air, those type of things, right? So that is one reason many times people get a job, is so that they have a level of income or some form of benefits on the job in order to meet these basic physiological needs. Once these needs are met, meaning once they're perhaps making enough money to meet these basic needs, now the things that motivate them in this area are not as important anymore. Now it begins, they look at things like safety. So what safety might have to do with is, for instance, making sure that their family is taken care of, making sure something as simple as they're safe on the job, making sure that they're healthy to be able to do the job. That is where so the first level, basic pay, making sure that that's good enough to meet those needs, is a type of reward. Now maybe certain types of benefits are needed in order to reward people so they now meet these safety needs. Continuing along on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, also you have love and belonging. So safety, love, belonging, friendship, family, those things, they start to interact with each other, if you will, a little bit. What I mean by that is once the basic needs are met, then perhaps we start looking at something like work-life balance. Is an individual working 12, 15 hours a day and not spending enough with their time with their family? As a result, their performance, their production levels are lower. Well, if we can now begin to meet not just the safety needs, in other words, them knowing that their family is secure and their relationship with their family is secure, but also that they are getting enough of that love, that affection, that belonging, that interaction with their family, so that way it does not negatively impact their work experience. There's a significant amount of research in this area of work-life balance that shows when that balance is met, employees will be less problematic, their performance levels will be higher, they'll be more engaged in their work, and on and on. Moving up the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, eventually rewards like benefits, pay, time off, scheduling, flexibility, some of that no longer will matter once people have all those rewards. Now they might be looking for more. That's when we start looking at esteem and self-actualization. What this might have to do with is letting employees know that once they achieve certain levels of performance, for instance, maybe they will be now involved in a leadership development program. Maybe they will now be involved in a program that will train them and develop them to be supervisors, to be leaders within the organization. Maybe these individuals are sent to school and their schooling is paid for, or their extra training's paid for, so that way they can develop other internal skills that they have and meet desired goals that they have that are above and beyond just doing their job. By doing this, you will then see that the rewards that are provided on the job are much more effective. Money is not wasted because we're just giving out pay raises where people are not really motivated that much by pay, for instance, if they're at that level. Or it could be the other way around, where people are actually giving a little bit more money because their basic needs are not being met. They need just a little bit more money. They don't care about the benefits as much. They just need a little bit more money in order to pay those bills and feed their family. The type of reward is what we've been addressing. The frequency of rewards is also critical to understand. For instance, I developed a training program for an organization and I gave out rewards every three months. People were trained, their performance was evaluated. If they if they achieved certain levels of performance and accuracy and quality of their work, they got a reward. What I experienced was that the rewards no longer meant as much. They were given too often. People just expected them. They lost their value, they lost their meaning. I got to the point where now I was wasting money by giving out these rewards because they did not have the value that they once had at the beginning of the program. Considering frequency is important. Here's another example. Sometimes people are giving, let's say, an annual bonus. So it might be around a holiday like Christmas or a New Year's holiday or some sort of other celebration, for whether it be for the country or community or whatever it is. they're given a reward. Well, once they begin to expect it at that time, again, it loses some of its value. They expect it. Uh, Maybe they increase performance right before that or something, and then it goes back to normal, whatever it is. But if you have surprises, in other words, where maybe a certain bonus is given, and then a few months go by, and then something else is given that's different amount. It's more individualized, it's something for that individual, and then they don't get anything again for 10 months, but it's infrequent, different times. What happens is people get more excited. They no longer know when to expect these rewards, and when they're given, they're different. They're once again more personalized for them. And what will happen is the money that's invested into these rewards will have much more value, much more effect. Finally, let's talk about workplace culture. What we've addressed so far, all of these things contribute to the culture. If we are properly identifying what jobs and what characteristics and skills and abilities are needed for a job, if we are selecting the right people that they're the best fit for that job and for our organization, if we are training and developing people and properly evaluating and rewarding them, we are now developing a culture within that workplace. However, we may have also some other areas of the culture that if an organization recognizes what type of culture they want to have, then they can use that as also part of their training, development, hiring process, and also use to motivate employees and to create an environment where people have some of those same objectives in mind. Here's what I mean by that. You can have, one of my examples is customer first. Let's say, for instance, it's a hospitality industry. It's maybe a large hotel or casino, something of that nature. And part of the culture is customer service first, customer first. The customer might not only be that person that registers and stays at the hotel, the customer can also be each other as employees. In other words, excuse me, perhaps as a chef or a server within that organization. If one of the other employees comes to me from accounting and is talking to me about something, well, I treat them also as a customer. I give them the level of respect and an attention that you would give any other customer. By doing this, you can now develop a very positive workplace culture. Here again, that focuses on customer service. If you did not have that, then perhaps some people in one department would be treating customers much better, both internal and external customers, than another department. But by having a culture that's focused around this, now everyone is focused on the same thing, on the same direction, and you have a more unified group of people. Some other examples may be a servant leadership culture, where the focus is on others. The focus is on doing things for others, and even as high-level managers, you are putting all of those other employees first before your own needs. You can have a continuous improvement culture, such as, for instance, Toyota is known for their continuous improvement process, which has led to lean manufacturing. You can have a family-oriented culture, where that work-life balance we were talking about, for instance, is extremely important. And this can bring in employees that really value this family atmosphere. And then finally, you can have more of a community, greater good oriented culture, perhaps, in your organization, where it's not just about your organization, but it's about your community. That community may be within a small town or city, or it could be as large as a country. We want to focus on what is good for this community, and what's the greater good here. Not just us as, let's say, a manufacturing company or a distribution center or financial services, insurance, whatever else it may be. It's not just about us, but it's about the greater good, what we're doing here. And then so here again, now you can bring in people to your organization to work, to stay at your organization, to decrease turnover because they value this or one of these other types of cultures. Industrial organizational psychologists can help an organization develop culture. In conclusion, Hopefully now what you see is this connection between job analysis, competency modeling, structured interviews, assessment, training, development, evaluation, rewards, and all of these things put together to form a culture of an organization. I really hope you enjoyed this presentation and now better understand how industrial organizational psychologists apply their science to human resources and to the workplace. This is Dr. Dan Kohinka, and I want to thank you for your time. Have a wonderful and blessed day.